We're often asked about design principles for larger gardens, and the fact is that design principles for larger gardens and also for smaller gardens are very similar. And of course, larger gardens are often broken up into a series of rooms, and each of those follow similar design principles. However, I thought it would be nice to visit a large garden, and I'm visiting this with Stephen Ryan of the Horti-Culturalists YouTube channel, because Stephen is also a plant grower and he has worked in these gardens. And he's known these gardens since he was a child. So he's seen how this large garden has evolved, and he's also seen what works in it and what doesn't. And I thought that would be useful to any of you, whether your gardens are large, small, or of course middle-sized. It's Alexandra here from the Middle-Sized Garden YouTube channel and blog, and I'll put links to any resources we mention in the description below. And if you're new here, the Middle-Sized Garden uploads weekly with tips, ideas and inspiration for your garden. And if you'd like to see the videos when you open up YouTube, tap the subscribe button. And if you'd like YouTube to tell you when a new video is uploaded, tap the notifications bell. So Stephen, tell me a bit about the history of this garden and how it all kind of has come together and what you think works and what doesn't. So let's start with the history.
All right, the history. Tieve Tara, which actually means on the side of the hill in Gaelic, apparently, was started back in the 1890s, but it's had a number of owners through the period, and it's actually had a number of houses through the period. So the latest house was built back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, but there'd been at least 2 other houses on the site prior to that. Most of the owners up until the second last lot of owners weren't living in residence all the time. It was a country retreat, it was a weekender. So they'd come up and just swan around and enjoy themselves on the weekend. They would have garden staff looking after the garden, and they weren't garden oriented people necessarily. So Tieve Tara never became one of the really planty gardens until much more recent times. It had an owner back in the 1988-89 who started to spend some money on it. And so they installed 2 large lakes. They installed some paths and some walks and some arbours and things. And then they decided it was all too much for them and sold it. The owner before the current one then spent a lot of money on the garden, and they did some interesting things. They did things sometimes in a way I wouldn't have gone about. For instance sake, they had a designer that looked at the overall design of the garden, but then instead of that person taking control of the overall look and the planting arrangements and all that sort of thing, they actually invited experts in who had a particular bent. So there was a local nurseryman who was very good with perennials, so they asked him to design the perennial borders. They had somebody else who was, again local, who was a fuchsia nut, and they got them to plant up a fuchsia bed. They brought in a rose expert to plant up rose beds. Now the issue with all of that is, of course, that there's no sense of all those things marrying together particularly well. They're probably quite good examples of their own type, but they're not necessarily part of the overall design of the garden. I stepped in at about that time as well. I was seen to be one of the experts that was brought in, but my brief was actually to add to the plant diversity. So I wasn't locked into one area to put all my rarer, more interesting plants. So I was probably one of the few that had the sort of access to the whole garden, where I could then select sites, gaps, places where something needed to be extra, and incorporate plants of horticultural merit throughout the garden. Things that would grow well in this district. I have to say the rose beds haven't turned out to be particularly successful, for the very reason that roses actually don't do all that well up here. We've got altitude, we've also got issues with parrots, possums, mildew, black spot, you name it, roses can get it up here. So it's not an area renowned for its roses. Why anybody would go down that path was a bit silly, really, in a sense. So the rose gardens probably need ripping out and redoing completely. The borders now have got to a point, because it's been some years since the previous owners passed away, where they probably need to be pulled out and redone, because perennial borders tend to be like that. And it would be good to see somebody who had an overriding feel to try and pull it all together, because it's still not quite become a coherent whole, unfortunately.
So I think we can take from that even if you've got a large garden and it's divided up into rooms, and even if you you know, you want your rose garden as you would in Britain, and you want perhaps your Japanese area, and you want your this area.
Yep.
You can still actually find an overall overarching theme or sense that pulls it all together.
Yep.
And that's something, if you've got a larger garden, is to think about.
Yes, I think that's really important. So you do need to have that, either the owner or a designer of some sort who takes complete control over the overall look of how the garden all works. I think it's really important.
And for instance, you mentioned roses don't really work here. So
No.
that's another thing, is even if you've got lots of land and you can have anything you want, perhaps you can't always have everything
No,
you want.
you can't. I mean, roses do very well in the lower lying areas. I mean, Adelaide in South Australia is renowned for its roses. They've got a hot, dry climate, a heavyish soil. Roses absolutely thrive there. But here, we do far better with azaleas and rhododendrons and Japanese maples and the cooler climate plants that many people in England would be quite familiar with. And of course, we do have the pests that you don't have in England that just make it that extra bit hard to grow those particular plants well. So they don't work well here.
And you mentioned that you think garden arches ought to be really big and generous, and actually
Yep.
they have done some good arches here, haven't they? So would
they
you like
have.
to tell us about those?
Yes, well, again, they went out and got the arches made for the site, and I think that's always the best thing you can do. You can't buy a prefabricated arch that's going to do it. There's a path here that's very wide, so it's more sort of like a promenade than a path in a way, because several people can walk together down it, and not many gardens can offer paths that wide. So obviously, if you're going to put arches over them to sort of give a sense of enclosure over the path, then the arches need to be seriously large, and that they've done very well. They've built really nice metal arches. They've got them covered in old world roses, clematis, that sort of thing. And yes, they look substantial and they've got substance to them, so they're not flimsy things, and they do frame an arch, or they frame a path really well, because the path is the only access you've got. You have to walk through there. So they make sense in the space they are.
And there's another element, which is the Monet Bridge, and actually that's something that's kind of, people love Monet bridges, and you see Monet bridges all over the world.
Yep.
In gardens, and this one has actually got so overgrown that you can hardly see it's a Monet bridge.
Yes.
But what would you say about the kind of positioning of it, and generally if you're going to think about having a bridge in a garden?
All right, well, they decided to put their bridge over their lower lake, and the lake is sort of almost kidney shaped, maybe peanut shaped. It sort of goes out both ways, and the bridge comes through the middle. Makes sense. But the problem with it, apart from the fact that it's so overgrown now and they really need to do something about pruning the wisteria, you can stand up above the bridge, up on the top of the hill, and look down, and you can actually see that you can walk around the lake. Now, unless a bridge is the only way visually that you can access from one side to the other, then in a sense it doesn't make sense either. So you need to have your borders and your beds so extended out so that the water feature could in fact visually disappear behind things, and so could be much more substantial than it actually is. So you've got to trick people's brain into thinking that that bridge is the only way to go. I mean, in Monet's own garden, the bridge goes over more or less the end of a lake, but there is a stream that runs further up. So it is, well, there's no way of getting around it unless you've got waders on. So it is logical, and it sort of works. The gardeners also make sure that the wisteria on the bridge is pruned back to the extent that it is an adjunct, not the whole bridge, and that has become one of the problems here. The wisteria hasn't been properly trained. It's actually a tangled mess now, and it probably needs to be cut back extremely hard and then trained again. Climbers like wisteria are like puppies. They're not just for Christmas. You've got to work at them all the time.
That's brilliant. And of course that particular tip about bridges is probably very appropriate for much smaller gardens, because if you've got a very small body of water and you want to put a bridge in there and it's ornamental, you need to make jolly certain that that makes sense. You can't just have a pond with a bridge there and that's like a feature.
I've seen that. And it is very disconcerting to see a little tiny pond with a bridge going over the middle of it, and all you do is walk around it. It doesn't make any visual logical sense. So yes, bridges and boardwalks and all those things, they need to be purposeful. They need to be where you need to walk and where your mind and your eye will take you. Very important.
So we're actually standing here in the woodland part of the garden, and I think that's a lovely thing that, you know, large gardens often have areas of woodland and lovely cool places that, you know, you can go in the heat of the day. Tell me, what are your favourite parts of this garden?
Well, I have to say, down on through the woodland area, there is actually a boundary stream. So the property ends at the stream, and many properties in our area do that. They use the streams as sort of the boundary line for the property. It has its good and its bad side. You can't landscape both sides of the stream if you only own one. So you can't put bridges over onto the neighbour's property and all that sort of thing. So that's a bit of a downside. But to be able to walk to the bottom where it's lovely and cool, there's big trees overhead, there's moss, and there's, you know, it's got that fabulous woodlandy effect. I just wish I could do that in my own garden, because of course I don't have a natural stream. So it's probably one of my favourite parts of this garden, and in some ways it's my favourite because it's been possibly less tampered with than some other parts. It's actually almost a la natural. So it's kept clean, debris taken out, paths are kept open, some planting has been done, but there's a lot of native trees that have been allowed to grow there, and so it sort of ties the edges of the garden up with the native bush around, and it also makes the boundaries a little more amorphous.
Yeah. So in fact, if you have got a larger garden, I think thinking really about a woodland area, really in whatever climate or whatever soil you've got, a kind of woodland area just makes an element in a larger garden.
There was a famous English landscape designer who once said, no matter how small your garden is, it should have 3 acres of woodland.
Oh, yes. That's a really useful tip.
Yeah, you know, everybody should take that. Yeah, everybody can have that tip. I think it might have been Gertrude Jekyll who actually said that, but there you go.
I think you were right, yes, absolutely. Obviously the garden is at the moment under renovation, it's under new owners, so it will probably be very different in 3 or 4 years' time. Is there a part where you think, gosh, if it was me, this is what I'd do? Yeah,
look, I have to say the top lake, which we'll be looking at, the perennial borders there are odd as a perennial border because they're curved and they're on quite a steep slope, so they're not like a classical border. I mean, most perennial borders tend to be straight and flat, and you might have a double set of them with a lawn running down the middle, and that is your sort of borders. This one is on quite an arc and on quite steep slope, and when it was first planted up, it was reasonably complex and interesting. It's lost a lot of that because there's a number of plants that have become dominant. The perennials all need to be pulled out, which is going to be a huge job, but they all need to come out, and the whole border probably needs to be not just replanted, but actually rethought, because again, the trees and things are growing up bigger. The border isn't in quite as much sun as it used to be, and so therefore a new palette of plants are probably required to actually make use of that space. It's lovely to see it reflecting in the water below. Not many perennial borders have the opportunity to get the double whammy of a reflection, but it's now got far less complex, and there's some thugs in there that have virtually taken it over. So that'd be an area I'd love to play with.
And in fact, I'm also taking away from that if, for instance, you've either been too busy to look after your garden or you've moved into a new garden which has become very overgrown, is that you really do rather need to sort of take a deep breath and perhaps start from scratch with the perennial borders, if that's where your love is.
Look, certainly, I always recommend to people, if you've bought you've bought a property that's not a new property, if it's got an existing garden, don't be in an overly hurrying sort of way to deal with the garden. It's really important that you see what happens, particularly if you're not actually au fait with the plant material you're working with. So you need to see what things do, because sometimes a fairly inconspicuous plant can turn out to be something that's really spectacular, perhaps next season. So take your time. But certainly when it comes to things like perennial borders, they need to be revamped on a fairly regular basis, whether it be the whole border or whether you do it section by section over a period of time, because perennial plants need to be lifted, divided, the ground needs to be reinvigorated with manure and compost and things. And also some plants, you know, there's better varieties out there now sometimes. So, you know, why settle for the old scruffy aster with really tiny flowers if you can get the much better one with bigger flowers that have got a much stronger colour, for instance sake. So it's a good idea to see what is current and use more up-to-date plants for some of these borders that have been bred for specific purposes.
And I'm sure that actually as the renovation continues, that you'll be back probably covering the Horti-Culturalists.
Who knows? We could very well.
I think people should look out for that.
Yes,
because after all, I'll be in England most of the time, and you'll be here, so you'll be lucky enough to be able to see it as it develops.
Fantastic.
If you're interested in garden design, There's a garden design best videos playlist at the end of this video, and thank you for watching. Goodbye.